Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody comes back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Hi, I'm Tony Walker and I'm the narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, and I'm going to narrate you a ghost story. The purpose of this video introduction is just to prove to YouTube that I am real, and this is actually from the Valancourt Book of Christmas Ghost Stories Volume 1. I've got the 3 volumes. I would advise you to go and get them. Why not? And then you can read along and see if I make any mistakes. Spoiler, I do. I'm going to fade away now. I may come back later, but I will fade away now so you can get on with what you want to do. And hopefully listen at the same time. Or fall asleep. Or honestly, whatever you want to do, it's cool by me. The Doll's Ghost by F. Marion Crawford. It was a terrible accident, and for one moment the splendid machinery of Cranston House got out of gear and stood still. The butler emerged from the retirement in which he spent his elegant leisure. 2 grooms of the chambers appeared simultaneously from opposite directions. There were actually housemaids on the grand staircase, and those who remember the facts most exactly assert that Mrs. Pringle herself positively stood upon the landing. Mrs. Pringle was the housekeeper. As for the head nurse, the under nurse, and the nursery maid, their feelings cannot be described. The head nurse laid one hand upon the polished marble balustrade and stared stupidly before her. The under nurse stood rigid and pale, leaning against the polished marble wall, and the nursery maid collapsed and sat down upon the polished marble step just beyond the limits of the velvet carpet, and frankly burst into tears. The Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop, youngest daughter of the 9th Duke of Cranston and aged 6 years and 3 months, picked herself up quite alone and sat down on the 3rd step from the foot of the grand staircase in Cranston House. "Oh!" ejaculated the butler, and he disappeared again. "Ah!" responded the grooms of the chambers, and they also went away. "It's only that doll," Mrs. Pringle was distinctly heard to say in a tone of contempt. The under-nurse heard her say it. Then the 3 nurses gathered round Lady Gwendolen and patted her and gave her unhealthy things out of their pockets and hurried her out of Cranston House as fast as they could, lest it should be found out upstairs that they had allowed the Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop to tumble down the grand staircase with her doll in her arms. And as the doll was badly broken, the nursery maid carried it, with the pieces wrapped up in Lady Gwendolen's little cloak. It was not far to Hyde Park, and when they had reached a quiet place, they took means to find out that Lady Gwendolen had no bruises, for the carpet was very thick and soft, and there was a thick stuff under it, used to make it softer. Lady Gwendolen Douglas Scroop sometimes yelled, but she never cried. It was because she had yelled that the nurses had allowed her to go downstairs alone with Nina, the doll, under one arm, while she steadied herself with her other hand on the balustrade and trod upon the polished marble steps beyond the edge of the carpet. So she had fallen, and Nina had come to grief. When the nurses were quite sure that she was not hurt, they unwrapped the doll and looked at her in her turn. She had been a very beautiful doll, very large and fair and healthy, with real yellow hair and eyelids that would open and shut over very grown-up dark eyes. Moreover, when you moved her right arm up and down, she said, "Papa," and when you moved her left, she said, "Mama," very distinctly. "I heard her say 'Pa' when she fell," said the under-nurse, who heard everything, "but she ought to have said 'Papa.'" "That's because her arm went up when she hit the step," said the head nurse. "She'll say the other 'Pa' when I put it down again." "Pa," said Nina, as her right arm was pushed down and speaking through her broken face. It was cracked right across, from the upper corner of the forehead with a hideous gash, through the nose and down to the little frilled collar of the pale green silk Mother Hubbard frock, and 2 little 3-cornered pieces of porcelain had fallen out. "I'm sure it's a wonder she can speak at all, being smashed," said the under-nurse. "You'll have to take her to Mr. Puckler," said her superior. "It's not far, and you'd better go at once." Lady Gwendolen was occupied in digging a hole in the ground with a little spade and paid no attention to the nurses. "What are you doing?" inquired the nursery maid, looking on. "Nina's dead, and I'm digging her a grave," replied her ladyship thoughtfully. "Oh, she'll come to life again, all right," said the nursery maid. The under-nurse wrapped Nina up again and departed. Fortunately, a kind soldier with very long legs and a very small cap happened to be there, and as he had nothing to do, he offered to see the under-nurse safely to Mr. Puckler's and back. Mr. Bernard Puckler and his little daughter lived in a little house in a little alley, which led out of a quiet little street not very far from Belgrave Square. He was the great doll doctor, and his extensive practice lay in the most aristocratic quarter. He mended dolls of all sizes and ages, boy dolls and girl dolls, baby dolls in long clothes, and grown-up dolls in fashionable gowns, talking dolls and dumb dolls, those that shut their eyes when they lay down, and those whose eyes had to be shut for them by means of a mysterious wire. His daughter Elsie was only just over 12 years old, but she was already very clever at mending dolls' clothes and at doing their hair, which is harder than you might think, though the dolls sit quite still while it's being done. Mr. Puckler had originally been a German, but he had dissolved his nationality in the Ocean of London many years ago, like a great many foreigners. He still had one or two German friends, however, who came on Saturday evenings and smoked with him and played piquet or scat with him for farthing points and called him Herr Doktor, which seemed to please Mr. Puckler very much. He looked older than he was, for his beard was rather long and ragged. His hair was grizzled and thin, and he wore horn-rimmed spectacles. As for Elsie, she was a thin, pale child, very quiet and neat, with dark eyes and brown hair that was plaited down her back and tied with a bit of black ribbon. She mended the dolls' clothes and took the dolls back to their homes when they were quite strong again. The house was a little one, but too big for the two people who lived in it. There was a small sitting room on the street, and the workshop was at the back, and there were 3 rooms upstairs. But the father and daughter lived most of their time in the workshop because they were generally at work, even in the evenings. Mr. Puckler laid Nina on the table and looked at her a long time, till the tears began to fill his eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles. He was a very susceptible man, and he often fell in love with the dolls he mended, and found it hard to part with them when they had smiled at him for a few days. They were real little people to him, and when they were brought to him, maimed and injured, their state seemed so pitiful to him that the tears came easily. You must remember that he had lived among dolls during a great part of his life, and understood them. "How do you know that they feel nothing?" he went on to say Elsie. "You must be gentle with them. It costs nothing to be kind to the little beings, and perhaps it makes a difference to them." And Elsie understood him because she was a child, and she knew that she was more to him than all the dolls. He fell in love with Nina at first sight, perhaps because her beautiful brown glass eyes were something like Elsie's own, and he loved Elsie first and best with all his heart. And besides, it was a very sorrowful case. Nina had evidently not been long in the world, for her complexion was perfect. Her hair was smooth where it should be smooth, and curly where it should be curly, and her silk clothes were perfectly new. But across her face was that frightful gash, like a sabre cut, deep and shadowy within, but clean and sharp at the edges. When he tenderly pressed her head to close the gaping wound, the edges made a fine grating sound that was painful to hear, and the lids of the dark eyes quivered and trembled as though Nina was suffering dreadfully. "Poor Nina!" he exclaimed sorrowfully. "But I shall not hurt you much, though you will take a long time to get strong." He always asked the names of the broken dolls when they were brought to him, and sometimes the people knew what the children called them and told him. He liked Nina for a name. Altogether, and in every way, she pleased him more than any doll he had seen for many years, and he felt drawn to her and made up his mind to make her perfectly strong and sound, no matter how much labour it might cost him. Mr. Puckler worked patiently a little at a time, and Elsie watched him. She could do nothing for poor Nina, whose clothes needed no mending. The longer the doll doctor worked, the more fond he became of the yellow hair and the beautiful brown glass eyes. He sometimes forgot all the other dolls that were waiting to be mended, lying side by side on the shelf, and sat for an hour gazing at Nina's face, while he racked his ingenuity for some new invention by which to hide even the smallest trace of the terrible accident. She was wonderfully mended. Even he was obliged to admit that, but the scar was still visible to his keen eyes, a very fine line right across the face, downwards from right to left. Yet all the conditions had been most favourable for a cure, since the cement had set quite hard at the first attempt, and the weather had been fine and dry, which makes a great difference in a doll's hospital. At last he knew that he could do no more, and the under-nurse had already come twice to see whether the job was finished, as she coarsely expressed it. "Nina is not quite strong yet," Mr. Puckler had answered each time, for he could not make up his mind to face the parting. And now he sat before the square deal table at which he worked, and Nina lay before him for the last time, with a big brown paper box beside her. It stood there like her coffin, waiting for her, he thought. He must put her into it and lay tissue paper over her dear face, and then put on the lid. And at the thought of tying the string, his sight was dim with tears again. He was never to look into the glassy depths of the beautiful brown eyes any more, nor to hear the little wooden voice say, "Papa?" and "Mama?" It was a very painful moment. In the vain hope of gaining time before the separation, he took up the little sticky bottles of cement and glue and gum and colour, looking at each one in turn, and then at Nina's face. And all his small tools lay there, neatly arranged in a row, but he knew that he could not use them again for Nina. She was quite strong at last, and in a country where there should be no cruel children to hurt her, she might live 100 years, with only that almost imperceptible line across her face to tell of the fearful thing that had befallen her on the marble steps of Cranston House. Suddenly, Mr. Puckler's heart was quite full, and he rose abruptly from his seat and turned away. "Elsie," he said unsteadily, "you must do it for me. I cannot bear to see her go into the box." So he went and stood at the window, with his back turned, while Elsie did what he had not the heart to do. "Is it done?" he asked, not turning round. "Then take her away, my dear. Put on your hat and take her to Cranston House quickly, and when you are gone I will turn around." Elsie was used to her father's queer ways with dolls, and though she had never seen him moved so much by a parting, she was not much surprised. "Come back quickly," he said, when he heard her hand on the latch. "It is growing late, and I should not send you at this hour, but I cannot bear to look forward to it any more." When Elsie was gone, he left the window and sat down in his place before the table again to wait for the child to come back. He touched the place where Nina had lain, very gently, and he recalled the softly tinted pink face and the glass eyes and the ringlets of yellow hair till he could almost see them. The evenings were long, for it was late in the spring, but it began to grow dark soon, and Mr. Puckler wondered why Elsie did not come back. She had been gone an hour and a half, and that was much longer than he had expected, for it was barely half a mile from Belgrave Square to Cranston House. He reflected that the child might have been kept waiting, but as the twilight deepened, he grew anxious and walked up and down in the dim workshop, no longer thinking of Nina, but of Elsie, his own living child, whom he loved. An undefinable, disquieting sensation came upon him by fine degrees, a chilliness and a faint stirring of his thin hair, joined with a wish to be in any company rather than to be alone much longer. It was the beginning of fear. He told himself in strong German English that he was a foolish man, and he began to feel about for the matches in the dusk. He knew just where they should be, for he always kept them in the same place, close to the little tin box that held bits of sealing wax of various colours for some kind of mending. But somehow he could not find the matches in the gloom. Something had happened to Elsie, he was sure, and his fear increased. He felt as though it might be allayed if he could get a light and see what time it was. Then he called himself a foolish old man again, and the sound of his own voice startled him in the dark. He couldn't find the matches. The window was grey still. He might see what time it was if he went close to it, and he could go and get the matches out of the cupboard afterwards. He stood back from the table to get out of the way of the chair and began to cross the board floor. Something was following him in the dark. There was a small pattering, as of tiny feet upon the boards. He stopped and listened, and the roots of his hair tingled. It was nothing, and he was a foolish old man. He made 2 steps more, and he was sure that he heard the little pattering again. He turned his back to the window, leaning against the sash so that the panes began to crack, and he faced the dark. Everything was quite still, and it smelt of paste and cement and wood filings as usual. "Is that you, Elsa?" he asked, and he was surprised by the fear in his voice. There was no answer in the room, and he held up his watch and tried to make out what time it was by the grey dusk that was just not darkness. So far as he could see, it was within 2 or 3 minutes of 10 o'clock. He had been a long time alone. He was shocked and frightened for Elsa, out in London so late, and he almost ran across the room to the door. As he fumbled for the latch, he distinctly heard the running of the little feet after him. "Mice!" he exclaimed feebly, just as he got the door open. He shut it quickly behind him and felt as though some cold thing had settled on his back and were writhing upon him. The passage was quite dark, but he found his hat and was out in the alley in a moment, breathing more freely and surprised to find how much light there was still in the open air. He could see the pavement clearly under his feet, and far off in the street to which the alley led, he could hear the laughter and calls of children playing some game out of doors. He wondered how he could have been so nervous, and for an instant he thought of going back into the house to wait quietly for Elsie, but instantly he felt that nervous fright of something stealing over him again. In any case, it was better to walk up to Cranston House and ask the servants about the child. One of the women had perhaps taken a fancy to her and was even now giving her tea and cake. He walked quickly to Belgrave Square, and then up the broad streets, listening as he went, whenever there was no other sound, for the tiny footsteps. But he heard nothing, and he was laughing at himself when he rang the servant's bell at the big house. Of course, the child must be there. The person who opened the door was quite an inferior person, for it was a back door, but affected the manners of the front, and stared at Mr. Puckler superciliously under the strong light. No little girl had been seen, and he knew nothing about no dolls. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler tremulously, for all his anxiety was returning tenfold, "and I'm afraid that something has happened." The inferior person said rudely that nothing could have happened to her in that house because she had not been there, which was a jolly good reason why. And Mr. Puckler was obliged to admit that the man ought to know, as it was his business to keep the door and let people in. He wished to be allowed to speak to the under-nurse who knew him, but the man was ruder than ever, and finally shut the door in his face. When the doll doctor was alone in the street, he steadied himself by the railing, for he felt as though he were breaking in two, just as some dolls break, in the middle of the backbone. Presently he knew that he must be doing something to find Elsie, and that gave him strength. He began to walk as quickly as he could through the streets, following every highway and byway which his little girl might have taken on her errand. He also asked several policemen in vain if they had seen her, and most of them answered him kindly, for they saw that he was a sober man in his right senses, and some of them had little girls of their own. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when he went up to his own door again, worn out and hopeless and broken-hearted. As he turned the key in the lock, his heart stood still, for he knew that he was awake and not dreaming, and that he really heard those tiny footsteps pattering to meet him inside the house, along the passage. But he was too unhappy to be much frightened any more, and his heart went on again with a dull, regular pain that ground its way all through him with every pulse. So he went in and hung up his hat in the dark, and found the matches in the cupboard and the candlestick in its place in the corner. Mr. Puckler was so much overcome and so completely worn out that he sat down in his chair before the work-table and almost fainted, as his face dropped forward upon his folded hands. Beside him the solitary candle burned steadily with a low flame in the still, warm air. "Elsa, Elsa," he moaned against his yellow knuckles, and that was all he could say, and it was no relief to him. On the contrary, the very sound of the name was a new and a sharp pain that pierced his ears and his head and his very soul, for every time he repeated the name, it meant that little Elsa was dead, somewhere out in the streets of London in the dark. He was so terribly hurt that he did not even feel something pulling gently at the skirt of his old coat, so gently that it was like the nibbling of a tiny mouse. He might have thought it really was a mouse if he had noticed it. "Elsa," he groaned, "Elsa," right against his hands. Then a cool breath stirred his thin hair, and the low flame of the one candle dropped down almost to a mere spark, not flickering as though a draught were going to blow it out, but just dropping down as if it were tired out. Mr. Puckler felt his hands stiffening with fright under his face, and there was a faint rustling sound, like some small silk thing blown in a gentle breeze. He sat up straight, stark and scared, and a small wooden voice spoke in the stillness. "Papa?" it said, with a break between the syllables. Mr. Puckler stood up in a single jump, and his chair fell over backwards with a smashing noise upon the wooden floor. The candle had almost gone out. It was Nina's doll voice that had spoken, and he should have known it among the voices of 100 other dolls. And yet there was something more in it, a little human ring, with a pitiful cry and a call for help, like the wail of a hurt child. Mr. Puckler stood up, stark and stiff, and tried to look round, but at first he could not, for he seemed to be frozen from head to foot. Then he made a great effort, and he raised one hand to each of his temples and pressed his own head round as he would have turned a doll's. The candle was burning so low that it might as well have been out altogether for any light it gave, and the room seemed quite dark at first. Then he saw something. He would not have believed that he could be more frightened than he had been just before that, but he was, and his knees shook, for he saw the doll standing in the middle of the floor, shining with a faint and ghostly radiance. Her beautiful, glassy brown eyes fixed on his, and across her face, the very thin line of the break he had mended shone as though it were drawn in light with a fine point of white flame. Yet there was something more in the eyes, too. There was something human, like Elsa's own, but as if only the doll saw him through them and not Elsa, and there was enough of Elsa to bring back all his pain and make him forget his fear. "Elsa, my little Elsa!" he cried aloud. The small ghost moved, and its doll arm slowly rose and fell with a stiff, mechanical motion. "Papa?" it said. It seemed this time that there was even more of Elsa's tone echoing somewhere between the wooden notes that reached his ears so distinctly and yet so far away. Elsa was calling him, he was sure. His face was perfectly white in the gloom, but his knees did not shake any more, and he felt he was less frightened. "Yes, child, but where? Where?" he asked. "Where are you, Elsa?" "Papa?" The syllables died away in the quiet room. There was a low rustling of silk. The glassy brown eyes turned slowly away, and Mr. Puckler heard the pitter-patter of the small feet in the bronze kid slippers as the figure ran straight to the door. Then the candle burned high again. The room was full of light, and he was alone. Mr. Puckler passed his hand over his eyes and looked about him. He could see everything quite clearly, and he felt that he must have been dreaming, though he was standing instead of sitting down as he should have been if he had just waked up. The candle burned brightly now. There were dolls to be mended, lying in a row with their toes up. The third one had lost her right shoe, and Elsa was making one. He knew that, and he was certainly not dreaming now. He had not been dreaming when he had come in from his fruitless search and had heard the doll's footsteps running to the door. He had not fallen asleep in his chair. How could he possibly have fallen asleep when his heart was breaking? He had been awake all the time. He steadied himself, set the fallen chair upon its legs, and said to himself again, very emphatically, that he was a foolish old man. He ought to be out in the streets looking for his child, asking questions and inquiring at the police stations, where all accidents were reported as soon as they were known, or at the hospitals. "Papa?" The longing, wailing, pitiful little wooden cry rang from the passage outside the door, and Mr. Puckler stood for an instant with white face transfixed and rooted to the spot. A moment later, his hand was on the latch. Then he was in the passage with the light streaming from the open door behind him. Quite at the other end, he saw the little phantom shining clearly in the shadow, and the right hand seemed to beckon to him as the hand rose and fell once more. He knew all at once that it had not come to frighten him, but to lead him. And when it disappeared, and he walked boldly towards the door, he knew that it was in the street outside, waiting for him. He forgot that he was tired and had eaten no supper and had walked many miles, for a sudden hope ran through him, like a golden stream of life. And sure enough, at the corner of the alley and at the corner of the street and out in Belgrave Square, he saw the small ghost flitting before him. Sometimes it was only a shadow where there was other light, but then the glare of the lamps made a pale green sheen on its little Mother Hubbard frock of silk, and sometimes, where the streets were dark and silent, the whole figure shone out brightly with its yellow curls and rosy neck. It seemed to trot along like a tiny child, and Mr. Puckler could almost hear the pattering of the bronze kid's slippers on the pavement as it ran, but it went very fast, and he could only just keep up with it, tearing along with his hat on the back of his head and his thin hair blown by the night breeze and his horn-rimmed spectacles firmly set upon his broad nose. On and on he went, and he had no idea where he was. He did not even care, for he knew certainly that he was going the right way. Then, at last, in a wide, quiet street, he was standing before a big, sober-looking door that had 2 lamps on either side of it and a polished brass bell handle which he pulled. Just inside, when the door was opened, in the bright light, there was the little shadow and the pale green sheen of the little silk dress, and once more the small cry came to his ears, less pitiful, more longing. "Papa!" The shadow turned suddenly bright, and out of the brightness the beautiful brown eyes were turned up happily to his, while the rosy mouth smiled so divinely that the phantom doll looked almost like a little angel just then. "A little girl was brought in soon after 10 o'clock, said the quiet voice of the hospital doorkeeper. I think they thought she was only stunned. She was holding a big brown paper box against her, and they couldn't get it out of her arms. She had a long plait of brown hair that hung down as they carried her. She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler, but he hardly heard his own voice. He leaned over Elsie's face in the gentle light of the children's ward, and when he had stood there a minute, the beautiful brown eyes opened and looked up to his. "Papa," cried Elsie softly, "I knew you would come." Then Mr. Puckler did not know what he did or said for a moment, and what he felt was worth all the fear and terror and despair that had almost killed him that night. But by and by Elsie was telling her story, and the nurse let her speak, for there were only 2 other children in the room who were getting well and who were sound asleep. "There were big boys with bad faces," said Elsie, "and they tried to get Nina away from me, but I held on and fought as well as I could, till one of them hit me with something, and I don't remember anything more, for I tumbled down, and I suppose the boys ran away and somebody found me there, but I'm afraid Nina's all smashed." "Here's the box," said the nurse. "We couldn't take it out of her arms till she came to herself. Should you like to see if the doll's broken?" And she undid the string cleverly, but Nina was all smashed to pieces. Only the gentle light of the children's ward made a pale green sheen in the folds of the little Mother Hubbard frock.
If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past.
Hi, so that was The Doll's Ghost by F. Marion Crawford, which was published in 1896, quite a while ago now. So as normal, I'm going to tell you something about F. Marion Crawford. Now, my eyes will snake over to the screen because I can't remember it all. Anyway, so he was born on 2nd of August 1854 in Bagni di Lucca in Tuscany in Italy, but he was of American stock. So he was the son of sculptor Thomas Crawford and Louisa Cutler Ward, nephew to the poet Julia Ward Howe. He was educated across Europe and the US, including Cambridge, Heidelberg, Rome and Harvard. He briefly edited an Indian newspaper after studying Sanskrit, experience that fed his debut success novel Mr. Isaacs, published in 1882. In 1883, he settled in Italy, permanently near Sorrento, building a life and career in Italy that shaped more than half of his prolific output. A champion of romance over didactic realism, he wrote a book about the novel called The Novel, What It Is, published in 1893, and he said the purpose of fiction is to amuse and please with balance and craft. Fair enough. His finest achievements are the Italian family sagas, Saracinesca, 1887, and Sant'Ilario, 1889, and Don Orsino, 1892, which dramatise social change with vivid settings and brisk narrative moments. He wrote historical works, actually non-fiction works, Ave Roma Immortalis, or if we're going to do it in Latin, Ave Roma Immortalis, rather than Italian, 1898, Rulers of the South, 1900, and Gleanings from Venetian History, 1905, rooted in close, loving attention to Italian culture and place. Now, his supernatural tales. We have done The Upper Berth, which is his most famous story, and it's set on a go and listen to it, but it's on this channel, but it's set on a boat traveling between America and Europe, which I'm guessing he was fairly familiar with. He wrote The Screaming Skull, which I haven't done, For the Blood is the Life, which is often anthologized in vampire stories and set in Italy, if I recall. I've read it, but I haven't narrated it. And this one, of course, The Doll's Ghost, and he collected these in a volume called Wandering Ghosts, Uncanny Tales, and they were praised by M.R. James. And I actually think this isn't a scary ghost story really in lots of ways. There are moments when it is a bit scary, but the resolution is actually quite sweet. His ghost stories refine a particular mode of supernatural fiction, the atmospheric tale rooted in specific material detail, a ship's cabin, a skull on a mantelpiece, a villa's architecture, rather than Gothic castles or abstract dread. Now, you might not get the significance of that. If you think of the early Gothic novels, they had a lot of scene dressing. So it was like, the castle, the library, even the characters are scenes, aren't they? The moody Italian, the mysterious Transylvanian, it's this Gothic stuff. It's all about vibe. It's the thunder and the lightning. Now, what happens, and that is, I think even Dracula, 1895, is of that ilk. But what happens later as the 20th century unfolds is we get a new kind of horror, which we might call materialist horror, whereby the horror is in an object. So this is the doll. It's actually a physical object. And elsewhere, the work of evil, we see that, if you go and look on that, there are other stories like this. But as the 20th century grows, we see horror is actually in objects, and this is mirrored in culture outside literature. If we think about the Annabelle doll, the Amityville horror, they are, and particularly the Annabelle doll, which is very related. This Annabelle doll is supposed to be a true story, but the difference is the horror is in the physical. It's no longer in the suggestion. And I think maybe M.R. James does use this in his props, the whistle that you find, the tractate Mid-Oth, of course, and we're getting close to that. But later on, this develops into the body horror, I think, where the horror is visceral and physical. So it goes from being a suggestion or an atmosphere to an actual horrific object, and it isn't a big step from that to the zombie horror, which is repulsive. So I think the thing that objects can do for us, that in a scary way. So they're scary in different ways is what I'm saying. So the atmosphere and the suggestion and the footsteps coming up the stairs can frighten us. But later on in the 20th century, we get this actual physical horror where the things that frighten us are zombies, are dismembered bodies, which are piles of gore, or seeing the actual destruction of a body, which I think, if we look at ancestral fears, the first sort is that, what's around the corner? What is that noise? And our threat detection goes up. And the second is seeing the results of predation. So our ancestors, going back to our, mammalian ancestors, would have been all too familiar with their kin their close and their nearest and dearest being ripped apart by a predator or being eaten themselves, although presumably there's not a lot of time to reflect on that. But so you see what I'm saying? So this is materialist horror, material horror, and whereby the first step is to place the horror inside a physical object, and then it develops, and we get like Clive Barker's Books of Blood and things like that, where and you know, and of course the slasher 1980s slasher movies where the horror is absolutely physical. This is related to the idea of the abject, which I may talk about slightly later. So the story itself, The Doll's Ghost, published 1896. What is it about? Well, it's a heartwarming tale, and my take on it is that this is a man who has spent too much of his time in a fantasy world. So this is related to the archetype of the pure Eternus, which is the boy who never grows up, which is the Peter Pan, who never deals with the real world but prefers to live in his head. And it's actually interesting because the doll doctor is clearly physically very talented, but he mistakes the dolls for reality. And that isn't to say he is totally neglectful of reality, but he's forgotten. His attention and his love and his passion is misplaced in these unreal objects. And I think we have the first scene, which is very pragmatic, whereby the lady, the 6-year-old aristocrat girl, comes out with her doll, which she's not supposed to have, drops it, it smashes, or it breaks a little bit, and so the staff are worried they're going to get in trouble. One of them says, "Oh, it's just that doll again," and she herself says, "Oh, Nina's dead. I'm going to dig a grave for her." So it's completely unsentimental. This is just an object, even to the little girl who may have considered it, but she didn't really consider it a creature because she is totally unconcerned by its passing. She's going to dig a grave for it. It's just part of the game of pretending, isn't it? But then she takes it to this man, Mr. Plucker. Now, I think the fact that he's half German, half English is a nod to E.T.A. Hoffmann and the German tradition of dolls and automata, which I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about. So the fact he's German, I don't think is a mistake. I think this is Marion Crawford nodding at The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which of course I've done in this channel if you want to go and listen to it. So this guy persists in his unreality, and he is so upset about this doll. It's interesting that it's across her face. It's interesting that there is a line of light across her face, isn't it? I think that means something, which I may, if I remember, talk about. It's remembering all these things, you see. And I do have my notes, but my mind skips around, as you know. But I'm trying to drive forward with this idea of his sentimental attachment to the doll in place of his daughter. So he sends his little daughter out to deliver the doll. And to be fair to him, he doesn't consider it particularly dangerous. But, you know, the night is, I mean, it's spring. And so the evenings are long, but she doesn't come back. And as she doesn't come back, the loss of the real girl, and of course I should say a little bit, and something I don't think worked out completely well, was I thought when she's brought up in England, so she'd be Elsie. Whereas for him, she's Elsa, more Germanic. You know, I'm not sure I managed to keep the distinction because it wasn't massively well defined in the text, what I'm saying. You know, it wasn't clear when she was. Basically, I think I invented that distinction. Marion Crawford didn't. So I was probably going a bit beyond myself there. But that's the explanation of why I pronounce it in two different words. So Mr. Puckler's daughter, Elsie, Elsa, goes and she's missing, and then he starts to really worry. And there's a subtext of class here, as you know. He's an American, so but he observes, and he must, if he spent any time in England, then lots of his ghost stories, or a number of his ghost stories, have, you know, he clearly spent time in England. He knew the setup, and he goes to the back entrance because he was a tradesman and he wouldn't be allowed to go to the front entrance. And the servants who are, when I actually worked in a hotel many years ago, and it was quite a posh hotel, and what I found was that the waiters and the staff were the biggest snobs at all. They were massively aware of class distinction and who fitted in which level, and guarded it. So we can see that this servant at the back isn't really helpful to Mr. Puckler. But Mr. Puckler, his love for his daughter comes out, and the true value, what's really important. Now, he can't find her, and then the ghost of the doll comes. And we're playing with a couple of things here, and one is the fact that we are primed to see a doll as being evil. So, I mean, think of Chucky and all these people, and we are prepared for it to be evil, but it isn't. It's actually helpful, and it leads him to her, and then we're prepared for the daughter to die. And him to be punished for his sin. Remember, I've said that, not just me, but ghost stories and horror stories are usually about a sin. Somebody commits a sin which allows the monster in, and the monster revenges because all stories are moral tales, on the father. But I think Marion Crawford here is more forgiving than many stories, and he allows Mr. Puckler to be forgiven for his sin. His sin was he was too wrapped up in his imagination when he should have been attending to his real business, which was the love of people in the real world. But that comes out in the end, and he's forgiven. Yeah, and I think that it's a little character arc in a very short story. Some things that we might want to say are about the motif of the helper. So you probably know there's folk stories at 3 stages. Arne, Thompson and Ute, a German, an American and a Finn, I think, at different times started to categorize motifs in folk stories, look at the folk stories across the world, and they saw recurring elements. And I suppose the idea there is that these represent human concerns across civilization, across time, that we as humans are concerned with certain things, and the job of stories is to remind us, as I said, the moral things about how to behave. So if you think of lots of fairy tales, there are helpful animals very often who the hero is kind to an animal, and in response it helps him with a task that he has to do in the real world. So this is the helper, and I'll give you the motif numbers. The ATU, which is Arne, Thompson, Ute, motif 554, grateful animals. So Nina, I think, is a grateful doll. She is grateful that he bestowed so much care upon her and fixed her with such care and repaired her, that she is grateful, and because of that she rewards him and helps him. This is the same motif. There isn't actually a motif D1000, magic powers from objects and dolls, and so she's a magic helper. So in many tales a hero is given a doll, a sword or a small helper figure that guides them, performs impossible tasks or alerts them to danger. The moment Nina's ghost appears, its entire function changes from being an object of sentimental fixation to being a tool of divine guidance, fulfilling the precise function of a magic helper. Now, another chap who attempted to look at stories and art and look at consistent features that arise from our humanness. You may say they're socialized, but because they occur right across all societies, I can't say all societies, but mostly the ones I know about, was Carl Jung, of course. I often talk about Carl Jung. So Carl Jung's idea of the archetypes is that there are motifs, figures, symbols that reoccur right across history, right across humanity, right across people, because they are about us being human. He called that the collective unconscious that was filled with personified, because we tend to see, look at the clouds, we see a person or an elephant. Okay, an elephant isn't a person, but we personify. We tend to deal with persons or agents, and an animal is an agent. I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well, I think. So we're looking at things that have will and desire, that we tend to see the world. And this is animist, of course. The trees, the animals, the clouds, the weather have desires. We confer agency on them, and so that's the respectable side of Carl Jung. What we found when Carl died, and finally his work was published, that he went a bit further than that, and he actually found in the unconscious personalities which were agents. So they weren't just bits of yourself, although they are bits of yourself, but they wanted something. and they wanted something from you. Now, one of his most famous archetypes is the anima for a man, which is the female part of the man. But she represents more than that. She's the gateway to the unconscious. And so it seems to me that this little doll is an anima function, and thus she's shining with the numinous light, what they call the lumen naturae, the light of nature. So to expand upon that, there was the lumen sapientiae, which is the light of wisdom. That is to say, what God gives us from our knowledge and our reason. And there is also the divine light shining that illuminates from nature, which isn't a totally Christian idea, but I think it's there. So what we would say about this is that she represents that part of Mr. Puckler that knows that for his own development and own individuation, as Jung would say, becoming a fuller whole person, he needs to come down from the skies and find his very human daughter. And this is the unconscious compensating. So the doll is a figure from the unconscious, because his conscious mind isn't capable of doing this, so his unconscious in the personification of the doll has to do it. In the meantime, Sheila came home, the dogs went wild, I got hot and took my shirt off, and the light faded a bit, so I put a light on. So let's talk about some other things about the story, the doll's ghost. So I try to look at it from different points of view, the meaning of the doll and what the doll is doing. The first thing to say is, let's think about what it is. It's a thing that is almost human, but isn't human. That's really important. Obvious, but important. So there's the skin of humanity there. And it seems to me that 3 different possibilities present themselves when we look at a doll or related things like a mask or a robot, something that looks and moves almost human, but it isn't. So the first thing that we might think is it is empty. Here is a thing that moves and talks to an extent, certainly as a ghost, and it looks like a person, but it doesn't have the full range of human expressions. The first thing we might see or might conceive is there is nothing inside. Now think about if you met somebody that you knew, your mother, your brother, your best friend, your teacher, and there was something off about them. And when you looked at them, you had the insight that there was nobody there, that there was something moving and talking, and that is actually pretty scary. So I'm going to come to threat detection in a minute. I think that fear is related to threat detection. The next thing that we might say that can happen with a mask or a doll is possession. So it might be that this inanimate object has been possessed by a malevolent spirit. So this is again a theme. Now elsewhere you'll have heard me talking about my Punic mask and the chanting that came from it, which was my supernatural experience, one of them. You'll find it somewhere. It's in, I've written a book about it. Just read my books, it'll be fine. You'll find out. So, and this is like a hermit crab, the little crab that has no shell of its own, and it goes and takes over other shells. And there's a deep, the Annabelle doll, for example, was a possessed creature. And this idea that human-like creatures can be possessed by non-human entities. Again, the key issue here is malevolence, and we do not know what it intends for us. So if it was an enemy, we'll be able to read its body language. It isn't what it seems to be, it's possession. And the third thing that might happen, which is a bit more subtle, is projection. So projection is a psychoanalytical mechanism which happens all the time. We do it all the time. And it's related to what the French anthropologist, I think he may have been Swiss, Levi Brule, no, I think he was French, talked about la participation mystique, which is how for early humans we are not separate from nature, and everything is our mental life is spread out, our spiritual life, our mental life, amongst everything. We're not distant, we're not defined, we're not separate from going what is going on around us. So the stream has a spirit, and the tree has a spirit, and the house has a spirit, and we have a spirit, and our brother has a spirit, and we're not separate. We participate in it. Owen Barfield wrote another book called Saving the Appearances, which touches on this as well. It's quite a difficult book, but it's worthwhile. So, but what we do is project all the time. So typically the projection is if there's something we can't own ourselves. This is a step up, a step along from the participation mystique. I have to do the full French bof. We project qualities of ourselves into the other because we cannot own them. So it's related to dissociation. This isn't me, it's you. I'm not responsible for this. You did it. You know, it's something bad. You did it, not me. There's some fantastic things that go on with projection. I remember there's a guy I worked with who was a lot of fun, lazy, but a brilliant clinical mind. And we had a lady who we were seeing who had a difficult relationship with her mother. Her mother was extremely critical of her all the time. She was the critical mother. And so I went to see this woman. I came back to the office. It was a late shift. There was only me and him in the office. I came back and I said, I've been to see, Miss X, and I started to moan about her, and I'm like, and she's this and she's that. And he said to me, you have become the critical mother. And so we have this thing called projective identification. I think it's Melanie Klein comes up with this idea. She's a psychologist who comes up with this idea. I like Melanie Klein, but she's a bit depressing. And she says not only do we project our these qualities onto other people, they play along. Classically, we might be somebody who always is bullied, and so we keep finding bullies wherever we go. People will bully us, so it's almost like we expect to be bullied. We project stuff out, and they take it like a jigsaw puzzle, and they play the role. So he said to me, you're the critical mother then. I thought, you're right, that wasn't me. That was something that she evoked in me. Let's think about the dolls in horror and stuff like that, and supernatural stories and speculative fiction. So the classic, of course, is the 1816 story by E.T.A. Hoffmann, a German story, The Sandman, Der Sandmann, I believe. And there's a doll in that called Olympia. Now, if you go to Heidelberg Castle, it's not there now, but it was very famous for its garden of automata. So in the Renaissance period, or the late Renaissance period, Heidelberg Castle had a garden full of steam-powered, and they were the wonder of the age, And so I think the Germans are really interested in automata, as the Anglos are interested in ghosts. And that is to say, we Anglos quite like automata, and Germans quite like ghosts, but we produce ghosts, and the French mad for werewolves. So it's different cultural differences. Italians love the strega, we could go around every country and pick their favorite monster. In fact, that might be worth doing. So what we have is this idea, and Freud uses the Sandman story, E.T.A. Hoffmann's story, to develop his idea of the uncanny, which is the familiar, which is no longer familiar. And we've talked elsewhere about Freud's idea of the return of the repressed. That is to say, the things we don't want, we hide, we put away. We don't want to see you, but here it comes, And so the uncanny. And then we have, of course, a story which I did, which is Daphne du Maurier's 1937 story, The Doll, whereas the doll is used in a different way. I mean, the Sandman doll, this Marion Crawford doll, and Daphne du Maurier's dolls, basically, don't say it. Is it some kind of toy that she uses for love? Yes, it's a very weird story. Daphne was a good lass, and she's a good writer. And then we have John Wyndham's Chucky, and it was made into a film, of course, 1968. And that is a possession story, I think. The little figure Chucky is an invisible entity. So, but he's actually comes out as a doll in the movie, I think. I may be identifying there. And of course, then we have related ideas like the Gustav Mehring's Der Golem again a German language story. In Prague, however, where this created being wanders around, we have, of course, the Frankenstein monster, Mary Shelley's 1818 story. We have very ventriloquist dummies which appear in movies like Magic, 1978, Fats, that is, or Slappy from the Goosebumps series, and of course Robert Aikman's story, The Unsettled Dust, 1966, where he uses dolls and nursery figures to create, which he was very good at, quite a deeply rooted dread. And then, of course, we have things like Westworld, where that latches onto a more modern development, which is very much present in the fear of AI. I just got a book edited by a guy called Cohen called Monster Theory Reader, which I've read the introduction. That's about as far as I've got now. It's your typical sort of academic overwritten stuff, but the ideas might be good. And I'm going to talk about the Uncanny Valley. What is the Uncanny Valley? So there's a Japanese guy called Masahiro Mori. In the 1970s, he talks about about robots. And what the Uncanny Valley is, this disquiet that we get, whereby it's like a valley. So when the thing does not look at all human, it doesn't bother us. All right. When a thing is fully human, it doesn't bother us. But when it's nearly human, we feel uneasy. We're looking at it, and this is the Uncanny Valley. And the interesting thing is that it's not just humans, it's primates as well. Other monkeys have this thing, so it's deep in us. And what is it about, really? I'm personally not convinced here about Freud's return of the repressed in this story. There was a psychologist preceding or around the same time as Freud, Ernst Jentsch, and he linked uncanniness to the uncertainty of whether something is alive or not. Figures that seem animate but resist confirmation, so dolls, automata, waxworks, evoke anxiety because they hover between categories of life and mechanism. The mind cannot easily assign them to safe or unsafe. This is related to Jordan Peterson's idea. He doesn't specifically mention the Uncanny Valley, but in his book Maps of Meaning, in the first part, he talks about threat detection. So, published in 1999, he describes perception as an ongoing threat safety scan rooted in evolution. So we continuously read faces and bodies for intent, using subtle patterns of gaze, expression, and motion to judge whether an agent means us well or ill. A near-human figure triggers this machinery but withholds the information it seeks because the expected social signals are incomplete or contradictory. Vigilance remains high and emotional reassurance never arrives. And thus, when something is fully human, we get these signals, we read the person, we know whether they're going to batter us or kiss us or neither, and that's reassuring in a way. And then we have the middle, whereby we are really uncertain what this thing is and what it means for us. It's like a dog with a plastic bag. What is this? That's why they bark at them as they blow along. American Beauty is a great scene of that. Great. Not of a dog, just of a plastic bag in the wind. So the end is, it's not human. We're not bothered about it. We don't even think it has intention. Then we have this quasi area, which is very unsettling. And then we have the confirmation from the physical cues, the way it moves, that it's either gonna, or anyway, there we are. I think it's related to, I mean, there's such a richness. I mean, Frankenstein's, which I've done, go and listen to it, Frankenstein story, Mary Shelley's story of Frankenstein offers a completely different menu of things that we can think about the automata. And Westworld, which I loved, the first series. When they got into the real world, I wasn't so bothered. But when they were in the Westworld, I loved it. Is a different thing. Our fear of AI is exactly rooted in this idea of agency, which is really important. Earlier I talked about the participation mystique, whereby the primitive people, if you want to call them that, early people, not always early, they still exist, they live in a world that is animate and things have intentions. Now, I was saying about AI, the whole worry about AI is what will it intend for us. Listen to the dialogue. We may talk about there's some dislike of the fact it's inauthentic and it's slop and it denigrates humans and stuff like that. But the real concerns when people talk about stop this research now, it's because what if this thing had intentions to do away with us? And it's the same thing. It's an ancient fear. Same with aliens. There's this thing going past, is it Atlas? IV Atlas, I think, it's going past the sun at the moment, and people are going, it's 50% chance it's an alien spaceship. And we don't just go, oh, right, that's interesting. We go, what does it mean for us? Is it going to kill us? Is it going to do us harm? Same with the fairy folk. Same with ghosts. We're always tracking, scanning for threat. And so when you reduce it to that, it's really ordinary, isn't it? Our fear of ghosts, our fear of all these things is a very simple, everyday worry about, is that thing going to eat me? Simple as that. So that's the basis of all fear, and that's all I've got to say on the matter. So I've gone on a bit. Hopefully I can splice this edit together so it makes sense. So because I was interrupted variously by various things going on. Hope you enjoyed the analysis. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment, a nice comment. If you've got a nasty comment, don't leave it. But otherwise, anyway, I'll see you soon. All right, bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?